To Don't Talk TV. So it's the first Thursday of the month, first Thursday of October, and we're continuing with our live streams that we proposed we'd do. There seemed to be some interest in that, so as mentioned in the previous episodes, we'll be doing these the first Thursday of every month. This month we're doing it 8 o'clock because that's the new time for all episodes. Although I have to admit I'm not crazy about still being in the office at 8 p.m. So we may move it to 6 o'clock. So keep an eye out for that when the next live is mentioned. We'll be sure to mention the time. Also, 8 p.m. Eastern makes it hard for anyone on the East Coast to join us because now it's 9:30 if they're in Newfoundland. And we want to try to have as many people join us as possible. I know we do have a few viewers from out east. So that said, we've got a few viewers with us right now, and of course open to questions. That's the main point of these lives. But while I'm waiting for questions, I've always got a few things that I can talk about. So I know Bill C-63 has been people have been bringing it up. A few people have emailed us about it recently. It's kind of come back into the news cycle. C-63, we did an episode on that, episode 195, where I take a look at some of the parts that I was most concerned about, although there's a lot in that bill that we weren't able to cover. But 195, that was about almost 30 episodes ago, so that was early in 2024, maybe even late 2023, I forget exactly when that episode. It was in first reading at that time. I just checked today on parl.gcd.ca and confirmed that it's now in second reading. So it's made it past first reading. It's into second reading. Of course, it has to pass second reading, do third reading, has to pass third reading, then it has to pass 3 readings in the Senate. So as I said in 95, at the speed that this bill is going, I think it's unlikely that it'll make it into law before the election, even if the Bloc Québécois continues to prop up the government all the way until November of 2025. It's certainly not impossible, but it seems unlikely to me that it will become law. Now, a good question from Akasha of the Nile: can they retroactively arrest you for something you said 10 years ago? Well, unless they specifically wrote that into the law, generally, and I've never seen this, anyone can be arrested retroactively. You're bound by the laws as they were at the time. So that goes for things, if they weren't a crime 10 years ago, you can't be charged for it if you did it 10 years ago. It also applies to procedural things and evidence rules and sentencing regimes. So, well, the way it generally works with sentencing, you get the benefit of what's ever better, the law at the time that you committed the offense or the law in the present. You get to use whichever one is better when it comes to sentencing. And generally that's the way the law works on procedures. It's better for you, you get to use the older than you. But generally everything goes by old. Similarly, if something was a crime 10 years ago and it isn't now, in theory they could charge you, but they most likely wouldn't, because there'd be no public interest in prosecuting someone for something that was a crime but no longer is a crime. So that's a good question, but you wouldn't have to worry about things you said in the past being used against you. But if these laws do go ahead, they may cause problems. Although, as I said in 195, I recommend you watch that video. They don't change a lot in terms of making new crimes. What they really up the ante, they up the sentence. Although when it comes to new crimes, there's always things being proposed, and viewers may have seen now the new Democratic Party members have been proposing that it should be made a crime to question the residential schools narrative. Now, I think this is highly problematic and highly troubling for the same reason that the Holocaust questioning law produced by the Conservative Party of Canada is highly problematic. First and foremost, because I don't know what that means to question it, because what is the official narrative? Unless they're going to actually write in there into the law, required to believe, it's very unclear. And they did not write into the law you're required to believe in terms of the Holocaust. So that's the problem I have with that law. They don't say, for example, I mean, I presume that it would be a crime to say that fewer than 6 million people were killed in the Holocaust, but it doesn't actually say that in the law. So I don't know for sure whether that's illegal. It says that it's illegal to condone or downplay it in any way, but as I've said in my episodes on that, and I know my volunteer PR guy, Richard, he'll be Johnny on the spot posting the link to the episode where I talked about the cost questioning law in the comments box, so keep an eye there. You know, the problem is they don't define what all the details are that you're not allowed to downplay. What would be considered downplaying? So I use the example of there was a time, I remember fairly well, I think it was about 20 or 30 years ago, where there were a number of claims that people were made into human lampshades or made into soap in the concentration camps in the hall. This is a fact, so for any of our viewers from the RCMP or local police, I'm not saying I believe this, I'm just saying as far as I know, mainstream reputable historians have said that there's no evidence that people were made into human lampshades or made into soap. So my question is, would those historians run afoul of this law? It's not clear at all. It's written. I have no idea whether they would be being prosecuted, because it's not clear what the details of the narrative. They just say that when they define the Holocaust, that it's the systematic killing of Jewish people too by Nazi Germany, but that's all. It's so vague. It leaves it open to so much abuse, because they could just charge anyone that they don't like. If you would say an opinion they don't like, there's no objective standard to determine when have you crossed over the line into talking about things you're not allowed to talk about, or thinking about things you're not allowed to talk about, or questioning things you're not allowed to talk about. So that's a problem. And then the other problem with these sorts of laws, you know, the problem with the Conservative Party introducing this specific Holocaust laws, you just know that it's going to open up to, now everyone's going to want their various narratives in law, where it becomes a crime to question it. So, and that's exactly what's happening here with the New Democratic Party now saying it should be a crime to go to jail for, well, I presume life, because they'd probably be going off of what's posed by Bill C-63. C-63 proposes to increase the maximum penalty for Holocaust questioning or hate crimes from 5 years maximum to life. So I presume they would want the same for any questioning of the residential schools, but I have no idea at this point what they don't want you to be allowed to question. I mean, it'd probably be a good thing for people to have a bit more education in schools. I know I certainly didn't learn a whole lot about them. Generally, you learned that it was a thing, that something happened, but not enough in terms of specific details to know what are you not allowed to question, what are you not allowed to say. So, I mean, that's problematic above and beyond just the whole question of making it a crime to hold different opinions. I mean, we're into the realm of the enforcement of religious belief, and we're into that. And it's funny, the same people who will scream hysterically about the Spanish Inquisition, which, as an aside, was nowhere near as bad as the mainstream history leads it out. To the contrary, it was actually, from my perspective as a lawyer, impressively fair and procedurally fair. Now, there's some things that we wouldn't tolerate today, but those are artifacts of the time, of history. For example, the use of torture. Nowadays, physical torture is abhorred by our society, but in previous societies, it wasn't. I mean, it was universally used. And frankly, I think our supposed abhorrence of physical torture is really pretty hypocritical, because our courts have no issue with psychological torture. I watch videos of police inflicting, I believe, to be psychological torture on people all the time. That's considered, I mean, personally, a lot of times, I would rather get beaten by a police officer, I think, than some of the stuff where you're not letting people sleep for hours and hours and just constantly harangue and questioning them and berating them and subtly threatening that things will happen to their family, or telling them they're going to go to jail forever if they don't talk and things like that. Now, before I get too deep into the grass on that, there's just a question here from a viewer with a I don't know, I'm not being racist, I just don't know the language well enough to be able to tell whether it's Chinese script, or I'm pretty sure it's Chinese, and I believe Japanese use the same script, or the same, I guess you couldn't call it an alphabet, I forgot what it's called when it's with the symbols. I'm not a linguist, I'm a lawyer. But that individual asked about the Duluth model. I'm going to be straight up with you, I don't know what that is, so if you could maybe clarify that, or I can maybe it's something that I know of, but it's just by a different name. But it's not something that I'm familiar with. So while I'm kind of trying to multitask of having a glance at with one eye and talk to you with my mouth and look at the comments box with another eye. Viewer Patricia Brillo has commented that Francis Widdowson wrote a book called Grave Errors, which exposes residential school grave hoax. I'm not familiar with that book, but it's interesting. As of right now, we can have this conversation where we can discuss this book, and we can talk about is this a good book? Is it a book? Is it right or is it wrong? But there may come a time, if the NDP have their way. And based on track record, we could probably expect the Conservative Party to back them up on that. I mean, again, they're the ones, I hate to keep harping on it, but people need to realize, if you're interested in free speech, you don't want to vote for the Conservative Party. They're the ones who brought in that Holocaust questioning law. We're going to talk about that book right now. If the NDP has their way in a few years, books like this, Grave Errors, is going to be, figuratively speaking, thrown onto book burning piles. They're probably not going to do actual book barbecues with military parades going around them because, well, aesthetically, that is way too interesting of a spectacle for Canada to do. It has to be much more pathetic and progressive and with rainbow flags involved for Canada to do it. But figuratively speaking, these books will be being burned, which again is ironic because the same people who would absolutely lose their mind if you just played from the clip from Indiana Jones' Last Crusade, where the two Joneses, Dr. Joneses, go to Berlin, there's a book burning going on, they'd lose their mind over that, but then they're proposing these sorts of laws. So so just going back to that Duluth model question, the viewer confirmed that I was right, or I was at least partially correct, that Japanese use old traditional Chinese characters, so I was sort of on the right track there. And the Duluth model is the policing model, which assumes guilt for men in domestic abuse situations. So I am very familiar with that. I wasn't aware that it was called the Duluth model. In my experience, that's just the universal way that police do business, certainly in Canada. Well, I guess I shouldn't go that far because I've only practiced law in 2 provinces. But in Manitoba and in Ontario, where I have practiced law, that was absolutely the model that is pursued by law enforcement. And I mean, you could just look at the statistics. Now, people would say, well, the statistics, that's because the men are actually the ones doing it. Maybe they are. I suspect that there's also a factor that men are far less likely to ever report it to the police if they're being assaulted for various reasons. Some people say, well, it's because they'd be looked down upon, rightly or wrongly. And also, men just generally wouldn't care that much, or they don't want to get the police involved in their family. Men, this is my personal view, is men tend to be more rational, less emotional. So when you're more rational, you're going to think as well, do I really want to get the state involved in my relationship and tear my family apart over a slap or a push? No, I don't want to. Whereas if you're more emotional in the heat of the moment, you might pick up the phone and dial 911. So I think the statistics could be a reporting issue, but I think it's absolutely assumed, because I have definitely seen lots of cases in my 20 years where there's scant evidence that anything happened. There's known that there was some sort of altercation between two individuals, because usually it's neighbors of a certain female, middle-aged demographic who are keeping an eye on the neighborhood, concerned about safety of individuals, who call the police. They show up. They don't have any evidence of who did what, but they're going to arrest someone because of zero tolerance policy. And I've covered that on Don't Talk TV as well. I think every province has a zero tolerance policy, which short version of zero tolerance is if police get a call that's so-called domestic related, someone is going to jail. End of. Now, if they don't know who did it, the man's the one going to the jail. And I back in the early 2000s, when I was first a lawyer, when I was a prosecutor, I did come across cases where the police had absolutely no evidence with which to lay a charge. It was just along the nature of neighbors called, there was an argument. The neighbors couldn't say that they saw physical. They just said that they heard argument. So police go, and they're just like, well, we got a call domestic, so sir, you're under arrest, even though there's no evidence of assault. So the long-winded way of saying, although I didn't know it was called the Duluth model, in my experience, it appears to be absolutely in effect. Now, I imagine if we had, well, maybe I shouldn't prejudge that. I was going to say, I imagine if we had some HR person from police force on with us, they would say, no, we just respond to the evidence that we find on the ground. But that may not, they may actually, yes, because, you know, the data and et cetera show that men are generally the aggressors. That's why we kind of go in presuming that they're involved. So in 2024, it's possible they'd say that. It would be interesting to see. I'd have to look in to see if any statements have been made along those lines, if they've ever been questioned. I would be very surprised if mainstream media had ever questioned police on their policing practices, but something that bears looking into. So just trying to keep an eye. We've got some good activity going in the chat, so that's nice to see. I'm happy to see that. So Akasha of the Niles again asking about, how does a no trespassing sign apply? It doesn't really, because police, since they'd be in the quote-unquote official execution of their duty, they would be entitled to disregard a trespassing sign because they're not trespassing, quote-unquote, when they're in the official execution of their duty. I wouldn't rely on a trespassing sign anyway, but I mean, if they enter onto your property, well, be sure to watch next episode, because I've already filmed episode 222, and Richard can chime in. He's seen it already as well. He'll agree with me, I'm sure, that it's a very important, excellent episode where I've talked in the past about how to deal with police, but I figured demonstrating how to deal with police, a demonstration can often be more educational and more effective than just telling. So next week's episode, I do a number of demonstrations and like example scenarios, show how to deal with police if they're phoning you, or how to deal with them if they're at your door. So definitely have a look at that if you're interested in seeing a demonstration of the best way to deal with police when they're knocking at your door. Yes, I see Richard's agreeing with me. He says you don't want to miss it. And I agree. You don't want to miss next week's episode. And frankly, it was fun because usually my episodes are just me sitting in a chair talking. So it was fun to kind of get out, as it were, and do some demonstration, almost kind of some quasi role-playing, to take some demonstration of these techniques that I recommend at work. So I'm just, again, looking at the comments here. I see Franklin Fleming commented that he says he was abused by a woman and he took it and never called the cops, but she also abused mentally, which women do. I mean, it's interesting that mental abuse isn't illegal. Well, it's generally not illegal, although the criminal harassment is being so expanded that arguably mental abuse might fall under criminal harassment. So I can't say it's not a crime at all, but it's certainly not, historically has treated the same way as physical abuse. And again, if a lot of people would say that I'm just a horrible sexist and misogynist for saying this, but I think it's just a fact of reality that men tend to be larger and stronger than women. So when someone's larger and stronger than you, you're generally not going to use physical force. You'll use some other force if you're of a mind or of a temperament to be abusing another individual. So Mr. Fleming's asking, do you think that because the hate speech laws say anyone can question others in the group, if the LGTB say they accept all, does that mean anyone can question the group? Well, the thing is, the hate crime law don't actually specifically mention questioning. Let me just pull up the exact wording here of what the hate crime laws say, because it doesn't say you're allowed to question per se. What it says is this. So the hate crime law in 319 of the Criminal Code, and it says that everyone who, by communicating statements in any public place, incites hatred against any identifiable group, well, there's a couple sections, sorry, that's 319, also 318, because 319 talks about where the incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. Or sub 2 then says, everyone who, by communicated statements other than in private conversation, willfully promotes hatred against any identifiable group is guilty of an indictable offense. Now, the exceptions to that are if you can establish the statements communicated were true, if in good faith you are expressing or attempting to establish by an argument an opinion on a religious subject. Now, Bill C-63 seeks to delete that. It's also defense if the statements were relevant to any subject of public interest, the discussion of which was for the public benefit, and if on reasonable grounds believe them to be true. So sub C, that might be where you could get into the questioning, that you're saying things because you believe it's relevant to the public interest, and it was a discussion rather than you just being out there making a speech. Or D is if you in good faith said something for the purpose of getting it taken down, like saying like, oh, you know, this guy said Hail Hitler, so I want you to take him out. Like, you wouldn't be guilty for saying someone else said that. So the whole subject of public interest is interesting, and I think that might be why people protesting these drag story times and things like that. I haven't seen any of them charged with hate crime. They've been charged with criminal harassment, probably because the police figured they would have that argument that it was a subject of public interest that they're trying to discuss for the public benefit, and that they reasonably believed their position to be true. So I see a couple other good questions here, but I'll just, since we're on the topic of hate crimes, Akasha asked again, can you help us understand why it's racist to speak of a minority, but not racist to hate a white person? That's a good question, because the law as written clearly makes no differentiation. You're not supposed to hate anyone, but in reality, in the practice on the ground is clearly, I mean, and I've covered this, Richard, I'll trust you to find the episode and put the number up. I mean, I covered one case, forgetting the name, it was Her Majesty the Queen and Crow Chief, I think, or I think it was Crow Chief, where an indigenous lady ran up to a white woman screaming, "I hate white people," and punched the woman in the face, and the court said that wasn't a hate crime. Whereas I've also covered on other episodes that it is a hate crime worthy of multiple years in jail for making not even memes, just artwork to promote certain national identity, shall we say, or to talk to a certain group and make claims that they run certain institutions like banks and media. That's a hate crime, but running up to a white woman saying, I hate white people and punching them isn't a crime. The answer is not to be found in the law, because the letter of the law makes no differentiation. It comes down to the law and politics being downstream of culture. And so what it comes down to is our culture tolerates that. Our culture tolerates that double standard, not only tolerates, promotes it. Probably, well, this may be changing, but certainly up till very, if you ask the average Canadian on the street if they thought that non-people, minorities, so-called, I say so-called because, well, white people are probably still the majority in Canada, but that won't remain the case for too much longer with current immigration rates. I don't know if people saw this. There was, I think, something like 6 million temporary resident visas were issued last year. For a country of 40 million people, you know, that's a significant percentage right there. The average person probably would have said they thought that was okay. I think that may be changed as it's becoming more and more blatant that all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And before anyone says, "Oh, you're comparing people to animals, you're a racist," no, I'm quoting Animal Farm, George Orwell's novel Animal Farm. That's a line from that. Highly recommend you read that book if you haven't read it. It talks about 1984, but Animal Farm is excellent as well. It's a little bit easier read and a little bit more digestible. So I want to go back to the another question I have here about is it true that police must show their methods for collecting evidence, i.e. if they use a secret software backdoor, they must state that when presenting evidence gathered there. No, they don't. And to the contrary, they're allowed to actively hide their methods for collecting evidence because, what's the wording? Investigative privilege, they call it. So they're allowed to protect their investigative techniques. Specifically, where I've seen it a lot is when they're conducting surveillance. When I ask them where they were observing a person, because I want to test, you know, how far away were they, what angle did they have, things in the way to try to suggest that they couldn't actually see what they said they saw, or their view is obscured, so there should be some questioning of what they saw. Say, no, that they'll hide behind investigative privilege, saying that would reveal their methods, that would allow criminals to more easily detect them and evade detection. So they don't have to use, therefore it's not required for them to reveal their methods for collecting evidence, at least in terms of specifics. Broadly speaking, they would have to explain how they arrived at certain things, right? They can't just get in court and say, oh, we know he did this. They have to explain how they knew that. In terms of using a secret backdoor software specifically, I've never seen that. The only software I've seen used is this program called the Celebrate Reader, which just takes everything out of a cell phone. Interestingly, does not work on locked iPhones. I have yet to see an iPhone that was locked where they were able to extract anything from it, because Celebrate's incapable of breaching Apple's whatever their security software is on their phones. However, Celebrate absolutely gets Androids, which, I mean, I'm not, you know, necessarily wading into the Apple versus Android debate, but I think it's an interesting point of reference because I know that debate can get. Personally, I don't care too much because I try not to use my phone much at all. Actually, as you'll see next week, I comment on the fact that my cell phone doesn't enter my house generally. Or if it does, my house, it's in a Faraday bag and it's stored in a separate area for various reasons, not just avoid surveillance. Personally, I find living at home as if it's the 1980s to be far superior quality of life to living like it's the 2020s, with being reachable all the time, with, you know, doom scrolling and TVs and all that. But now, in terms of planting software in your computer for surveillance, they would have to do that with a warrant. Well, to do it legally. Doesn't mean they're not doing it illegally, but if they're doing it illegally, they can never use it in court. But that doesn't preclude intelligence agencies using illegal methods to gather information, because intelligence agencies like CSIS or PMP's ITAC, they're not so concerned about building a case for court, so they don't need to really worry about the legality, because that's the only consequence they ever have, is having evidence excluded from court. If they don't care about evidence being excluded from court, there's really nothing to stop them from using all sorts of means to hack into or observe the contents of your phone. And if any of you, Edward Snowden is a bit of a name that's disappeared into the mists of history. He was a big name for a while. I think that was over a decade ago when he came out and blew the whistle on a lot of the stuff that the NSA was doing down in the United States. If you believe him, and personally, I tend to believe him, I don't think he'd have reason to make this up. I mean, you're going to destroy your life and get exiled to Russia, of all places. Like, what is the point of that? Why lie about that? I think it must be true. He said that the NSA had the capability to, hack into and remotely operate pretty much anyone's device, and they would routinely turn on people webcams, their cell phone cameras, and have a listen and a watch what they're doing. I know a former RCMP officer who's told me that back in the 80s, they would remotely activate the microphones in people's phones and listen into what people were discussing in their. So that back in the 80s using analog technology. So I have very little doubt that people like NSA, CSIS, ITAC, CIA, that they are surveilling a lot more than people would think, or people would like to think. Oh, well, I'm laughing at a question. We're not going to say that name on this show. Just another intelligence agency was mentioned or alluded to. I'm not even going to touch that. So Kimberly Jane commented, liking my practice of living like it's the 80s at home, and she makes a very good point about online banking. Now, I think online banking is unavoidable to an extent. I don't think there's any way of completely getting around it, because there's certain things that they just won't accept other forms of payment. I think trying to use it as little as possible and trying to use cash more is a good idea. And we always get examples of this. Remember, a year or two ago, the internet was out for a week and cash was king again. The only people with cash were the only ones that could buy anything. And we're seeing that again right now with the hurricane damage in the United States. It's the only people with cash are able to, because everything's down there. Now, just while we're on the cell phone, my views on cell phone use, does that apply only if you're using on Wi-Fi and not on the phone? I don't think it matters how you're using it. They can get into it through Wi-Fi or through cellular. Either way, it's sending and receiving data to, quote unquote, the system, the internet, the phone system. So they'd be able to access it either way. So I don't think it makes a big difference. So we're just past 35 minutes. Again, I've been at work for 12 hours at this point, so I'm not sure how much longer we're going to go, but we'll try to get through a few. Physical Digital asked about the law that's passed third reading in the House of Commons, the WHO medical agreement. Honestly, I haven't had time to read that in sufficient detail to have any informed opinions on it. From what I've heard from other people, I mean, frankly, looking at how things went from 2020 up till 2022, 2023, after that experience, I'm automatically suspicious and wary of anything involving the World Health Organization. That's my being uninformed about specifics of the law. I can say as an informed opinion based on everything that we saw happen in 2020, 2021, 2022, I wouldn't want to see the WHO having anything to do with any of our laws. I mean, I would frankly like to see Canada disassociate itself from the WHO. Obviously, that's not going to happen anytime soon, but at least not giving them any more power or any power at all through our laws is what I think would be the safer course, because it's not exactly like they did some great job. And the more time goes on, the more evidence is piling up that so many things were wrong about what happened. I mean, I'm on record in episode 51 and other episodes talking about the absolute unconstitutionality and really legal abomination of the vaccine mandates, of medical segregation people. I mean, these things are just completely foreign to our law. But we're also starting to see evidence now. There's, I guess the gold standard in the medical community is peer-reviewed papers, and I assume these are peer-reviewed papers not written by AI like mainstream ones. They're coming out showing that actually the lockdowns are what did all the damage. People died from lockdowns, not from COVID-19. So, that just, the evidence is now coming out now that time is passing. So, yeah, I would want to stay well away from the WHO. And Kimberly Jane is pointing out another important point where, I mean, people, actually I haven't seen them in a while, the people in my comments box who like to come and berate me about why are you supporting Maxime Bernier, you need a conservative. Well, Pierre and the Conservative Party of Canada, they're all on board the WHO thing, just like they were all on board with making conversion therapy illegal, as I've covered before. It's like they're the ones who introduced the Holocaust questioning law. I think they might be counted on to maybe do something good with the carbon tax, which might make life a little bit less onerous in terms of cost of living, but I think that's about it. So at the end of the day, I mean, this is a legal channel, not a political channel. I find politics interesting, but I mean, you vote for who you want to. I'm never going to be like those Conservative Party of Canada people who are going around berating people. You have to vote for this person or that person. You vote for who you think is the best person after you've informed yourself. That's what I'd say is inform yourself, then vote. Don't vote because I told you to or because someone else told you to. So just trying to get caught up with the comments here. It's a nice problem to have where the comments are going by quickly enough that I'm not able to read them all. What is the legality of unlearning white supremacy and other DEI session and training? Is a question from Franklin Fleming. Well, that's an interesting question. The problem is the legality is it's illegal. It's legal, like it's completely legal, because there's no law anywhere that says you can't do that to people. Yeah, arguably, I'd say this unlearning white supremacy stuff would fall under the hate crime law, where you're communicating by statements other than in private conversation, stuff that willfully promotes hatred. I'm sure a lot of people agree with me. A lot of this unlearning white supremacy stuff, white fragility stuff, white people are racist, colonialism. A lot of this stuff is really promoting hatred of people of a European background. So technically, it might be illegal, but again, in practice, no police officer is ever going to even investigate that. It's just. Unfortunately, reality on the ground, as I've talked about this on the show before, that you've got the law as written, but then you've always got the laws that's actually applied in life, and unfortunately, those aren't always the same. It would be nice if they were always the same, but society is populated by humans. The laws are applied by humans, and I think it has to be that way, because I think the law being applied by AI would be even more horrific, because AI has no free will. It's completely at the mercy of however it's programmed. And you can be sure that anyone who wants to have AI running anything, they're going to program the AI to do it their way. So I think the system we have, in many ways, is probably like the least bad. I don't know if there is a best on this, but given fallen human nature, which I believe that there is such a thing as human fallen nature. So yeah, the problem is, the DEI stuff for now, there's no legal recourse against it. I think, again, it has to be a cultural pushback. And I hadn't heard that. Franklin Fleming was mentioned that there was a principal who was harassed by his DEI trainer to the point that he committed suicide. I wasn't aware of that case. I'll have to, if you, Mr. Fleming, have a link to that, I'd be interested to see it, to have a look at it. I mean, it's obviously terrible, but that person probably wouldn't get into any trouble because they're on the right side, quote unquote right side. And we've seen this many times in history. There's nothing new or unique to Canada. I mean, a lot of this stuff, you can go to. I think that Weimar Republic Germany is probably the closest analogy that can be drawn. Sometimes people will mention Nazi Germany or Soviet Union or North Korea. I don't think those are as applicable as Weimar Republic Germany. Although the interesting about Weimar Republic Germany is, as law and order broke down there, the thing is the police and the military were in the hands of conservatives. Even though everything else was in the hands of far left radicals, the police and the courts tended to still be in the hands of conservatives. Because Weimar Republic Germany, that came around very quickly. We've had the slow boil in Canada, so they've had time to install people into all areas over 50, 60 years, whereas Weimar Republic Germany, I mean, the German Empire collapsed in 1918 at the end of the war, and then, Weimar Republic Germany was within the next decades after that. But the comparisons are obviously to the social decadence and depravity. I mean, Weimar Republic Germany was where the first ever sex reassignment surgeries occurred. But then the law was not applied equally, although since the military and the police and the courts tended to be in the hands of conservatives, it was actually the Nazis who to get a light touch. I mean, that's why Hitler, I think he got something like a 2-year sentence for trying to violently overthrow the government in Munich and the beer hall putsch. I mean, obviously, if someone like that tried doing that, well, as we saw from the men in Coots, they weren't even trying to do a coup. They were just doing a protest. They were blocking border, though. They're having the book thrown at them. Can you imagine if they actually tried overthrowing a local government? They wouldn't be getting any 2 years. So, but anyway, long way of just saying, we've seen this before, but I think it's, a lot of it's a cultural thing, and I think the number one thing is, and this goes back to other episodes I've talked about, ways to get out is opt out of the system, because we are blessed in Canada to have a situation where homeschooling is completely legal in Canada. You cannot say that in a lot of countries, like Germany. Can't say that in Germany. You'll literally go to jail if you don't send your children to the government brainwashing center, also known as a government school. But in Canada you can. So I think, protect your children from this DEI stuff. That's not legal advice. That's parental advice. That's my advice as a parent myself. Our children are our most precious treasure in Canada. So I think you're not going to be able to file. It just won't happen. You won't be able to file a court case that's going to get all this DEI stuff wiped out or make the teachers stop pushing this stuff on children. So you're better off to opt out, in my view. Okay, so just going back to that principal who went killing himself after being harassed by a DEI instructor. His name was apparently Raymond Blikszto. Well, I mean, that's a Polish name and a half. My wife's Polish, so I'm generally okay at pronouncing these things, but it still can be a bit tongue twistery. So Blikszto, Blikszczcto. So that's his name. So I have to have to look into that. Yeah, and just another side note on the whole unequal application of law. We've talked about this in a lot of episodes. Akasha of the Nile is mentioning Palestine protests blocking borders and roads. That appears to be okay versus the Freedom Convoy. Now, the whole Palestine thing is very fascinating to me because I was surprised. I thought that stuff was going to be crushed right quick, and it was in some instances. For example, University of Calgary, you can find videos of Calgary police quite assertively, shall we say, putting down protests at the University of Calgary. I thought that was going to be the way with Palestine, just given who they're protesting against. But really come to pass. Now they've, after that, generally been allowed. And again, this goes back to the cultural thing, because the people who run it, they know that the Palestine protesters have a lot of supporters, and that those supporters are going to really give them some pushback. Freedom Convoy didn't have some real supporters other than the people that were there on the ground. They were a truly disenfranchised group that the government wasn't afraid to stomp flat. So again, it comes back to that cultural thing. And the Palestine supporter, it's an interesting catch-22, or an interesting corner that the government's painted itself into, because they've been, berating us and scolding us for Islamophobia for so long that now they can't be Islamophobic by putting down a protest that's in favor of a Muslim country. So, I think that's interesting. And again, totally, different narrative than the Freedom Convoy. Because, there's saying from the beginning, people talking about freedom, they're idiots, they're insurrectionists, they're, whatever. So, again, comes back to that cultural thing. The laws and politics are down to culture. Hopefully the culture is slowly changing a bit. So, okay, so apparently the video's been choppy. Well, that's probably partly because of YouTube's horrifically bad live streaming, if you can even call it a service. I might have to StreamYard again. I think StreamYard's pricing is outrageous, and I just don't want to pay the money that they want per month just to do one live stream per month. But we might have to look into that and maybe upgrade the internet in my office, or do a live stream from another location with faster internet speeds. But that said, I think that's a good point to call it a night. It's because we've been going for about 50 minutes here, and I think my family would be happy to see me once in a while, since, as I mentioned, well, actually, no, I mentioned that in episode 222. Just no, the mic's not moving at all. Mice hasn't, it's very firmly secured, not moving at all. So there was a comment raised on last week's episode, or a question about, do your office closes at 4:30? What do we do if we need to speak to after 4:30? Well, the office closed 4:30, but that doesn't mean I stop working at 4:30. I mean, this is not the first night this week that I've still been, well, actually, this is the first night this week I've been in the office this late, but I'm in the office well after 4:30 every night, and the phones at the office do forward to my assistant cell phone. Now, I don't keep my cell phone on with me all the time, but there are ways for her to get a hold of me if it's a legitimate emergency, generally. So there are ways to get a hold of me, but please only do that if it's an actual emergency. If it can wait until the morning, I would appreciate holding off, because I do like to try and spend some time with my family as well. So thank you everyone for watching. This live stream, of course, isn't particular specific legal advice to you. It's just a general conversation, but if you need legal advice, call a lawyer. You can know my number, or you can call another lawyer that's closer to you. And I'll keep the show recommendations coming. We appreciate them, and sometimes I'm looking for, what am I going to talk about this week? So it's perfect if I have a request. And if you found this video at all interesting, helpful, or informative, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing. We're getting close to 8,500 subscriptions. I think 10,000 is the threshold before we'll start showing up on the algorithm a bit more, maybe being able to word a bit more. So please consider doing that, and thank you again for joining us.